Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the April meeting of the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society. My name is Jonathan Stair and I'm the president. And we're glad that all of you came today. You're in for a special treat. So, anybody here for the first time? Haven't been here before. Okay, you want to tell us your name, where you're from, and what you're researching?
Oh my, I'd rather not.
Okay.
But hi, everyone.
Okay, ladies.
This is my daughter. I'm Michelle Miller. This is Morgan Miller. We're not researching anything. We're just huge history buffs.
Okay.
So I was a history major in college and grad school, and she's gotten some of that love from me. So,
Well, I can guarantee you that this afternoon, you're gonna learn about an aspect of history that probably very few people know much about. So, welcome and thank you for coming. And thank you also, even if you don't want to share your information. So, okay, we had a snafu, so I do not have the minutes from the March 2nd meeting. However, in the absence of the minutes, if nobody objects, we'll just say that they're approved as they were circulated. And then we'll add those to our minutes. Treasurer's report, Margaret.
Okay, the treasurer's report, balance on February 28th, 2025 was $16,416.03. Receipts for the month of March, membership renewal of $35 and a publication sale of $42. There, for a total of $77 receipts. Disbursements, there were no disbursements for March. That made the cash balance as of March 31st, $16,493.03. The membership as of March 31st, 150 members.
Thank you. Adam, anything from the library? Sure.
Hello, everyone. I'm Adam Bentz. I'm the director of the Library and Archives, and I was asked to present some upcoming events from the History Center. It's not next anything. April 16th, that's not, several weeks from now. I can't count how many. 2 weeks from Wednesday, on April 16th, the York Civil War Roundtable will be meeting in this room at 7 o'clock that evening. And Cody Eash, who is from the Seminary Ridge Museum in Gettysburg, will be presenting a talk called Lincoln, Liberty, and the Sanitary Fairs of 1864. That's on April 16th at 7 p.m. Following Monday, April 21st, from 4 to 7 p.m. in this building downstairs in the lobby, we will be having a retirement reception for our CEO and president, Joan Mummert, who is retiring after 18 years of service to the History Center. If you're interested in attending that reception, please RSVP by April 14th. Give Local York will be taking place I think it starts on May 1st and goes through May 2nd. On May 1st, on Thursday evening, we'll be having a trivia event. Please check out our website. And on Friday night, that will be Friday, May 2nd, we'll be having an organ concert. And as you can all see, the Tannenberg organ has been put back together after, it seems like 2 years. It's almost 2 years, year and a half of restoration work in Columbia. So please give Local in mind. And if you like what our organization does, please donate. We always like that too. Second Saturday in May, that's May 10th at 10:30 a.m. Mike Maloney, a local historian, will be talking about his most recent book, Rattlesnake Colonel. It's a book about Thomas Cressa. I think many of you know who that was. Then one more event, our bookmarked event, which is basically an informal talk with historians. The next bookmarked event is May 19th at 7 o'clock p.m. And Associate Professor of History, Dr. Joy Giguere of Penn State, New York, will be here to discuss her book, Pleasure Grounds of Death, which is a great title. The Rural Cemetery in 19th Century America. So that's bookmarked on May 19th at 7 p.m. Always please check our website. We're constantly updating it with new events. We're very busy these days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. I just want to add something about Give Local York. If you donate online on, I think it starts sometime the evening of May 2nd, going through the next 24 hours. Give Local York has special benefits to organizations. If you, whichever organization is leading or gets so much money or so many people donating, they get extra money if you donate at that time. So if you want to support history here in York County, you want to support the York County History Center, that's a good time to do it. Log on, give some money, and that'll help whatever's going on at that hour. A lot of times there'll be matches or something, and the History Center will benefit from your donation. It's my duty at this meeting to announce the ballot of our officers for the coming program year. These are the individuals who are up for re-election. So those individuals will be Treasurer Margaret Berg, Recording Secretary Richard Robinstein, Corresponding Secretary Becky Ann Stein, and Director at Large Becky Roman. And we will not have a meeting, a formal business meeting in May because, which I'll mention in a second. So we will have our elections at our June meeting. Now, Richard Kunkel is going to tell us about this, but next month, our meeting is going to be at the Adams County Historical Society. And two things I want to say about that. One is that they are charging us $15 per person for the tour and the program they're going to be providing to us. If you want to attend that meeting, but you can't pay the fee, we will pay the fee for you. But I would like to know in advance, so I know how much extra money to take. But please don't let that amount keep you from attending. My personal goal is that we always have programs that are available to everybody, and so the society will cover that fee if you can't pay it. And secondly, about that is we may be carpooling from this site to Adams County Historical Society, so just watch our Facebook page. I'm not sure where's Erica. I'm not sure the next newsletter will be out before then, will it?
No.
No. So the best thing to do is watch the Facebook page or our website if you're interested in carpooling to the Adams County Historical Society from this location. And finally, I want to mention, and I'll probably mention this at every meeting until it occurs, on Saturday, September 20th, in this room, we will be having our 50th anniversary celebration. And Margaret and her team are busy preparing a wonderful event. So please put that on your calendar. It's going to start at noon and conclude somewhere around 4 o'clock that afternoon. Is there any other news that anybody would like to share at this time? If not, I'm going to have our Vice President Richard Kunkel come tell us about future programs and introduce our speaker.
Okay, so you already heard a little bit about next month's meeting. So that will be Sunday, May the 4th, 2025. And that is at 2 o'clock, so it's a little bit earlier. And it's at the Adams County Historical Society, which has the Beyond the Battle Museum. And we'll also have a individualized tour for our group of the Charles Gladfelder Research Room and Archives there. So the museum, which is to give sort of like a local perspective of the Battle of Gettysburg, is supposed to be quite good. And that is a audio tour, which you kind of do on your own. And like I said, we have this tour of their archive. So meet around 2 o'clock. You might want to, if you're going, you might plan to be there a little bit early, just so the fees all get paid and all that sort of thing. So they close at 4 o'clock. So we basically have 2 hours while we're there. Then our last meeting for this year, basically September through June, is on Sunday, June the 8th. And that is my hometown history, basically Jamie Norkel and James McClure. And it's the name of the presentation is When Peach Bottom Welsh Quarried Slate to Make Roofs That Seem to Last Forever. So it's about the Welsh down in southeastern York County, the Delta Welsh. And it wasn't, I was always told that Delta slate was considered the finest in the world at the Great Exhibition in 1851 in London at the Crystal Palace. So it was very high quality. If you look around in York County, even today, you'll find a lot of Delta slate on the roofs of older buildings. It's the nails that don't last forever. So, and then we have, as Jonathan said, we'll be planning programs for our 50th anniversary year. Marcia just told me that looking back through some old records in June of 1975, they had their meeting to think about organizing this organization, and then in October they actually did it. So the big celebration is September the 20th. The next meeting that we have that will actually be before that will be the last Sunday in August. So today we welcome back Tyler Stump. He's an archivist at the Pennsylvania State Archives in Harrisburg. If you weren't on the tour that we had up there, you must go visit there. It's a beautiful facility with lots of records, and Tyler has really gotten into some of the prison records and state hospital records, and Jonathan knew about this presentation and said it's really good, so I'm looking forward to it. It's about the Farview, not Fairview, Farview State Hospital for the criminally insane. So I won't take too much away from Tyler. He can explain all this, but if you'll help me welcome Tyler. There we get started.
Thank you, Richard. All right, hello, everybody. Y'all hear me okay? Yep. All right, let me just get my notes up real quick. All right, well, hello, everyone, and thanks for being here today. And thank you to Richard and Jonathan for inviting me here to speak. I'll just give you a little bit more background. Like I said, my name is Tyler Stump. I work at the Pennsylvania State Archives. I live up in Cumberland County, but most of my family is from York County, mostly from Dallastown, York Township. We've lived here for at least 10 generations, at least that's as far back as I've been able to trace it. So it's nice to be back in my kind of ancestral county to talk history with you all. At the State Archives in Harrisburg, I'm an acquisitions archivist by, most days, at least that's what I do, which means that it's my job to travel around the state and look at historical records, whether they're in attics or basements or, storerooms or whatever, and see what their historical value is, and if they, are something that's important for history, take them back to the State Archives in Harrisburg where we can make them available for research. And Farview State Hospital is one of those places where I have been in the past and got to kind of collect those records and bring them back to Harrisburg. So this is an institution that I kind of know a little bit about. I've had my hands on a lot of the records that are there. So Jonathan, when I started working, Jonathan was still at the State Archives, so he knows, or we've had a lot of conversations about Farview and some of the other state hospitals and other facilities in the state and how their records are just so important for genealogy. If we had an ancestor who was institutionalized in the past, they are a complicated and Byzantine set of records to look through to find really what our ancestors were going through, but they can be really rewarding when we do find out kind of what we're looking for. So I hope to kind of give you some background and some context, so that way if this is ever something that we want to do, we want to kind of explore some of these kinds of records to find our own ancestors. You won't be starting totally from scratch. I know in the past with this group, I've done talks on just kind of generally about state hospitals in Pennsylvania and generally about state prisons, but this one's going to be a little more specific to talk about Farview State Hospital, which is kind of a unique institution in Pennsylvania, which is a little bit different, but it kind of combines elements of state prisons and of state hospitals, so it's kind of an interesting mix. So that's where I will start things. And we'll have time at the end for questions also. So if there's anything on your mind, we definitely will have time to chat about that. And I hope that we can. All right, so 3 things that I'd like to talk about today. First is just kind of the general history of Farview State Hospital. So how it gets established, what it's like if you are a person who's living there or working there, and then kind of what the end of its history was. It's a facility that closes in 1995. It's no longer open today. After that, I want to kind of zoom in a little bit and talk about the life of a man named Lewis Ross, who was an inmate at Farview State Hospital. He happens to be very well documented. He's involved in a major court case in the 1950s. So we know a lot more about his life and his experience at Farview. but it really can tell us a lot about other people who were there who we might not have as many records left behind from those other folks. So I think it's kind of a good illustration of things. And then after that, so after we've kind of learned about the history and one of the people who was there, we'll talk about how you can find records from Farview and from other institutions that we have at the Pennsylvania State Archives. Because like I said, it can be a little complicated finding what we want. So we'll talk about how to access these things. We'll talk about looking at the Pennsylvania State Archives website and how to look at our catalog to see what's there, and also some digitized content and things like that. So that sound good to everybody for a good little agenda for the day? All right, great. All right, so this is a picture of Farview State Hospital. It is Pennsylvania's first and only state mental institution for what they call the criminally insane. I think that's the official terminology they use. I think that's kind of a loaded term. We'll talk about this a little bit more as we get into it, where we have a lot of evidence that the people who were there, that might have been on paper, they were considered criminally insane, but that's not always the case. I think archival records about this are a good place to start, but it doesn't always tell us the whole story. But we'll get into that. So I'll just kind of get that in your brains now to kind of keep as we keep going through. Farview, and I should say this again, because I know there can be confusion, it is not Fairview. My computer always autocorrects it to Fairview whenever I type the word out, but I assure you, it is Farview State Hospital. It is in Wayne County, which is the most northeastern county in Pennsylvania. It's actually located maybe about 25 miles northeast of Scranton, so it's up in that area. And it is high atop a plateau up in the Poconos there, and they literally call it Farview because you can see pretty far from the plateau where you are. And you can kind of see that in this illustration here. So it's got a far view from the top. It was opened in 1912, and it was opened through 1995, and it was closed and converted into a state prison. So a lot of these buildings that you can see here in this little picture here, they are still there, and they're part of the facility that's still there, although today it's going to be a state prison, so definitely no visitors today. You cannot go in there, so I would not recommend driving and knocking on the door. Farview typically admitted prison inmates who were diagnosed with various mental illnesses, violent patients from other mental hospitals and other kind of almshouses and other facilities like that around the state, individuals who were found innocent by reason of insanity in a court of law in Pennsylvania, and other court-ordered offenders in Pennsylvania. Although that changes somewhat over the years, but generally these are the types of individuals who are sent to Farview throughout its history. The majority of its inmates are from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, although there are individuals from every single county in the state. And I'll have some pictures and a little bit of some folks from York County and Adams County that were admitted to Farview over the years. Its peak population in 1960 was somewhere a little over 1,000 individuals were incarcerated here at Farview. And they had several hundred doctors, guards, and other attendants who were working there at the same time as well. So that's about the size of this institution. It's kind of middle of the road as far as comparing to other state hospitals and prisons in terms of its population and size. So it's kind of a medium institution in terms of size. All right, so let's get into the history of Farview. There has always been a historical relationship between mental illness and prisons in Pennsylvania. In fact, I would say in the United States. So kind of this relationship between insanity and incarceration. Before there was a Farview State Hospital or any other state hospitals in Pennsylvania, people who had what we would today diagnose as a mental illness, they're typically either cared for at home if their family had the means, or if they didn't, we're usually going to find them in a county jail or a county almshouse. And this is a time when the medical facts behind mental illness just aren't that well understood. Society usually considers having a mental illness the result of some sort of personal or spiritual failing. Basically, it's not really well understood. So it's a thing where we're going to see them, they're just kind of put in an almshouse or a prison or somewhere kind of away from society. In the early 19th century in York and Adams County, we know that there were insane people who were incarcerated both in the county almshouses and the county jail. And in the 1940s, the reformer Dorothea Dix actually surveyed the state, and she visited York and Adams County. And let me just look at my notes here. She noted that there were about 100 insane persons living in York County's jail, and another 100 in the almshouse, and about 50 each in Adams County's almshouse and state prison, or county prison rather. Conditions for people with mental illnesses varied widely depending on where you're living at the time, whether it's at home or in a county facility like the York County almshouse here I have up on the screen. Dix noted that conditions in York were better than most, and that Adams was, quote, a miserable condition. So she had no nice things to say about the Adams County Jail or almshouse. But she did note that in both of these counties that people were typically shackled and chained to the walls. So that's kind of the conditions that these people are facing, whether they were somebody who had committed a crime or not.
Did you say 1950?
Oh, I'm sorry, 1850.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, that would be a little bit different. You'd all know a lot more about that. Thank you for that. So that's kind of the conditions that we see in the state before there is a state facility like Farview or some of the other state hospitals that Pennsylvania creates. In the 1850s, so reformers like Dix are pushing for saying these are not good places, these county almshouses, these county jails. We need to have something else to care for these people who need a lot of treatment and better understanding for their conditions. And so there's several attempts to get the state legislature to appropriate funds to create state hospitals and other institutions that can care for these individuals. Finally, in the 1850s, they kind of get the political will to get budgets passed. And Harrisburg State Hospital is the first of these facilities that's built. I think it's actually opened in 1848, if I remember correctly. And that's in Harrisburg. And eventually other state hospitals are founded around the state. The first one's in Harrisburg, then we have up in Danville, then Warren, which is kind of closer to Erie, and then more spring up kind of throughout the state. Originally, state hospitals are kind of just a one-size-fits-all. Anybody who has any kind of mental illness, whether it's insanity, whether it's epilepsy, which is a common term we see at the time, whether it's a variety of other maladies, everybody will just go to the nearest state hospital typically. So you have at Harrisburg, it could be a wide range of conditions and individuals with different backgrounds. And if we look at the records from these hospitals, that quickly becomes a problem where you see superintendents and doctors at these hospitals who are saying, we don't have the staff, we don't have the resources, we don't have the expertise to deal with all of these different kinds of people who have various different needs. So eventually the state hears that and they say, okay, we need to build specialized institutions. And so we will see ones in Pennsylvania that are founded for people, elderly individuals who have dementia and other things like that. We have one specifically for people who are diagnosed with epilepsy, another one for children with intellectual disabilities specifically. So they kind of specialize. And Farview is part of this trend of specialized institutions. And it's spurred especially by hospital staff who are uneasy having violent patients in their state hospitals, and also from prisons in the state who don't really want to have individuals with mental illness who are considered insane, right next to other prisoners in the prison who are not. It just causes a lot of issues having them all kind of in the same space, and just having staff who are not really equipped or trained or prepared to work with these individuals. So there's kind of pressure coming from the state hospitals and also from the state prisons. They're like, neither of us can deal with these people very well. We need another place to handle them. So in 1905, the state passes a bill that authorizes the creation of a hospital for the criminally insane. Construction starts in 1908, and by 1912, that's when Farview is finally built. This is a picture here of the cornerstone at Farview right before it's laid in the building. The man here in the hat whose arm is on the cornerstone is Thomas Fitzsimmons, who was the first superintendent of the hospital. And the man to the far left, he's also wearing a hat. I forget his name, but he is the first, he's like the farm manager, basically. So Farview has a really large farm that a lot of inmates are working on. I actually had the opportunity to talk with his granddaughter, who is still living up there in the town nearby Farview, which is called Waymart. And so she had memories of her grandfather talking about being here at the construction in the early days of Farview, which is really neat because you don't talk to a lot of people who know somebody who was around in 1908 anymore. So that was a fun experience. Let's see. So after looking at a couple of different sites, they eventually land on this location in Wayne County. It's actually this is land that was owned by the Delaware and Hudson Railroad Company, which they had mined all the coal out of the area, so they didn't want the land anymore. So they sold it to the state for cheap, and the state was more than happy to take that land. But it is in the Poconos, so it's kind of on top of a high plateau. That's where this name Farview comes from, because you can see it really far from there. But one of the other things they really liked about this location is it was far away from cities and towns and anything like that. It's really kind of isolated and out there. Part of the thinking at the time is that the best treatment for individuals who have mental illnesses or who are insane is to just get them out in nature where the air is fresh and you can be away from kind of these very industrial and crowded places in society. So it kind of goes two ways. There's one, there's a belief that getting them in this kind of calm, peaceful, restful area where they're off on their own is going to be helpful. And then also there's this desire by a lot of individuals where they're saying, we don't want these kinds of individuals in our communities, in our towns. They're too violent, they might be dangerous, there's a lot of fear associated with this. So sending them somewhere like Farview, where they're kind of out of sight, out of mind, is also a desire on a lot of people's minds as well. So that's kind of, we have these two things that kind of combine to say that Farview is the best location for that we have in Pennsylvania within the state. All right, here is a map of Pennsylvania, and it shows all these different dots on the screen are other state hospitals and other institutions that the state is operating in Pennsylvania. And so Farview is the big red star that we have up in the northeast. And so I like this map a lot because it shows that though Farview is one institution, we talk about how it's in an isolated place, it's still part of this much larger network of hospitals and prisons and other things that exist all throughout Pennsylvania. Yes, Richard.
So what are the institutions in Lancaster and Franklin counties?
Let's see.
Franklin County would be
Mount Alto is one of them.
Yes, that's gonna be a sanitary.
Is that for tuberculosis?
restoration center.
Yeah, and they have various names over the years. I'm fairly certain. Let's see, I put a dime in there.
Elizabethtown.
Yeah,
Children's
that's the
Hospital.
Crippled Children's Home, what it was
Okay.
known as at the time. It's a closed facility. Most of these facilities are closed.
And the triangle is Harrisburg, right?
Yes,
Suffolk County.
yeah, and that would be Harrisburg State Hospital. So, if anyone has questions, I tried once I made this map and I put the names of all the institutions. It was so cluttered. I said, okay, I gotta do something a little bit simpler. Pennsylvania operates, and this isn't, I still learn about places that the state ran that, have been closed for decades. I did not know that Cumberland County had an inebriate asylum. That was the term for it until very recently. And we have no records in the state archives about this. So a lot of these places don't leave a very large paper trail, but these are places where lots of people lived and spent their lives. So.
Is that for alcohol?
Yes,
Okay.
that was the term. And did you have a question?
I'm sorry, I don't know if you want to take questions or not during the
We
course
can do a
of.
few. Yeah, let's go.
Well, I'm just looking at this map and it looks like there's this trend to locate them along the Appalachian Ridge line, so to speak.
Mhm.
Is that purposeful or
Yeah,
accidental?
with each place, you're gonna see various reasons for why they chose the site that they did. Sometimes that, they're kind of along transportation routes, sometimes it's where the land was available, basically. Sometimes they're expressly trying to get them in isolated areas. So that would be a great research project sometime for somebody not me, but yeah, that's definitely, I think that's an interesting thing, yes.
Out of all the possibilities, why did you pick Farview to talk about today?
Well, Jonathan asked me to, so that's the quick answer.
Okay.
But also, other than that, we'll get into this a little bit. Like I said, I do acquisitions at the state archives, so this is a place that I've been to, I've collected records from. So I feel like I know this one facility a little bit better than most. I've written a few articles and things like that about Farview as well, so I think it's a good chance, and we'll get into this as we go on, but the state hospitals and all these state-run institutions, it's such a large thing. We're talking about dozens of institutions, all that have thousands or tens of thousands of people who live there. This is a really big topic, so I thought if we kind of narrow it down to one place and just talk about it a little bit, we can learn the history of Farview, but I think it'll help us be more prepared to think about, if I have an ancestor who's at Harrisburg, at Danville, who's in Philadelphia or something, we can still we're better prepared to look at those other places as well. Yes,
Farview, of course, was unique,
yes.
the only one in the Commonwealth and it served the entire Commonwealth. Was this model used in other, in the rest of the country? Or
To some degrees, yes. There are other, what we call, quote, criminally insane institutions. Like there's one in New Jersey in Trenton, I know, which is, kind of right across the Delaware from here. Not every state does, and that kind of, it's really up to the state, and I think really just, is money available in that state at the right time politically to fund the establishment of a place like this?
And the other thing about the location of a lot of these institutions, the same with college system, it was to stimulate employment in these out of the way, no place, it was the big employer in some of these counties.
Yeah, and they still are in a lot of cases, and there are facilities that are closing throughout the state, which, were founded 100+ years ago. And there's a lot of anxiety, I say to put it very lightly, about these places closing, because it is the only sometimes
How
employer.
many state mental hospitals do we have?
Currently,
Right.
4, I'm pretty sure. So there's one in Danville, Torrance, which is in Westmoreland County, Warren State Hospital up in the northwest, and Norristown. So those are the only ones that are open. And Clark Summit, actually, so that makes 5 up, kind of close to Scranton as well. So the state does not operate a lot of these facilities anymore. This is definitely a 19th, early 20th century thing that is slowly going away. I think we'll see the close of them at some point in the future. I mean, it's hard to say, but that seems to be the trend definitely at this point, that they are all, that these places are built for thousands of people, and there's usually, a much smaller population today. So that seems to be the trend. But anyways, all right, let's keep moving on. We can definitely answer more questions as we go, but we want to make sure we get through everything. All right, let's get back to my notes. Great. And most of the pictures I have actually came in records that we've received in the last decade or so from Farview. So it's kind of exciting that these are a lot of, century-old photographs and things, but the State Archives is still acquiring things from so long ago. So it's nice to know there's still more history left to be explored in Pennsylvania for sure. So Farview, as soon as it opens and begins admitting, actually one thing I should state really quickly, with most state hospitals, they usually refer to the people living at them as patients. Farview is a little unique where they call them inmates. So again, it has this very special relationship with the prison system, with people who are being convicted of crimes. Not everybody who's at Farview is convicted of a crime necessarily, but they're all considered, or they're all called inmates if you look at the records and everything. Anyways, when Farview opens, almost immediately, it is just flooded with admissions, and it fills the capacity. It's actually over capacity in less than a year. And this happens for a variety of reasons, but mostly it's because every other state hospital and prison in the state, anybody that they felt like they weren't equipped or prepared to handle, they are trying to transfer them over to Farview. They feel like it's a facility that can take care of all of our quote problem individuals. Sometimes it's a good thing for them, sometimes it's not. We have a lot of audits and things like that where at the time where officials from Harrisburg are visiting, they're saying there's just too many people here, and some of them shouldn't be here in the first place. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But anyways, just suffice to say, Farview is always overcrowded for its first 50+ years of existence. And this is something that's very well documented. It's not a secret at all. So that's something that happens very quickly. Farview also has, they have on paper who they would like to come to Farview, but they're finding that basically anywhere where anyone is going to be sent over, it's going to happen basically. And Farview actually talks about a lot of times we don't even know who's coming to Farview. They come. The sheriff has dropped off another person at the state hospital, and so they sometimes don't even have the paperwork with them basically. So sometimes the records that exist from these people is very spotty, to say the least. But that's just that's something that's constant at Farview. Another thing that I think is really important to talk about is the labor practices. So Farview, like other state hospitals and prisons, has a large inmate labor program that employs the technical term that you'll see in a lot of documents. They call it industrial peonage, basically. And so this is unpaid labor that inmates are kind of expected to perform. A lot of times this is not voluntary labor. And this would be a variety of things. Actually, in the legislation that creates Farview State Hospital, it explicitly states that inmates will construct the buildings, operate the farm, and do other types of manual labor that's going on at Farview. So they are literally building the buildings that they are living and working in. So Farview has a very large farm, which is hundreds of acres, which they are building up. It has a brick factory, so they're actually producing bricks, which are used to build structures and buildings at Farview, but also other state hospitals and prisons throughout the state. The state hospitals in Allentown, and there's a few off that I can't remember off the top of my head, but all of their buildings are built with Farview's bricks. So that's another thing that's kind of a large labor program. Inmates are also operating the laundry and the powerhouse and the kitchens, a lot of these other places. So the Farview really, just like a lot of other institutions, it really relies on this labor program to operate and to keep its expenses down. And we'll talk about later on, this kind of becomes a really big issue for Farview when its population starts to shrink. and is not able to kind of keep these programs up anymore, it becomes a problem when they're not able to get all their work done. But these are kind of the hallmarks of Farview, where we have an overcapacity institution where people are constantly trying to be sent there. We have a lot of kind of varied admission practices. People are coming from the court system, they're being transferred from other state hospitals, other state prisons in the state for a variety of reasons. And we have these different labor programs that are going on, which is kind of integral to how this facility can function. So if we do have an ancestor who was at Farview, chances are they were working in one of these different labor programs while they were there. The records that exist don't really document this super well, but we know if we look at the reports, they talk about, I think it was like 70–80% of all the inmates are working in one place or another. So I would say if you have an ancestor who was institutionalized, kind of, I'd say 1930s or earlier, anywhere in Pennsylvania, odds are that they're probably doing some sort of job while they're at the institution. All right, another interesting photo of some of the guards and other staff who worked at Farview. So Farview's first few decades are pretty kind of, I would say, pretty status quo of these, like the initial years, like we talked about. We have this overcrowding, which is a kind of a continual thing. We find very quickly that there's a lot of staff shortages at Farview, where because of this kind of isolated area, there aren't a lot of people who live there locally who want these jobs. And so they have to try and convince or encourage people to move there from other parts of the state. But we see if we look at the reports and some of the other correspondence from Farview to Harrisburg, and they're talking to other people who work in the system, and they're just saying we're having a lot of trouble getting doctors and nurses to move here to Wayne County to work in this place. So that's kind of a really big issue, and that's one of the reasons why they kind of employ a lot of inmates in a lot of different jobs, or actually in a lot of cases, as soon as people are being discharged from Farview, they turn around and hire them, and they actually stay here and do other jobs at Farview. We also have, let's see, I have a couple of quotes up here on the screen that just come from different letters and reports that we have in the archives. One of them is Dr. Thomas Fitzsimmons, who's the superintendent, where he's writing to another colleague and just saying, we know very little about very many of the criminal patients sent to Farview. And this was instigated by an interesting case where they have an inmate who's sent to Farview. He doesn't come with any paperwork or anything. And about a month later, they hire a new guard who starts at Farview, and he sees this other inmate. He says, I know this guy. When I worked at another state hospital, he stabbed me. And they had no idea this was a violent inmate. They just knew he was somebody who showed up. So then they're like, okay, we have no idea that this guy has this violent history, which should have been in his paperwork and everything, but he came with no paperwork. And this is just one of many stories, and so they have they start these new practices, right? We have to write back to the other hospitals, ask if they've had violent outbursts or incidents or anything like that. So that's just one of many stories that we've seen where there's a lack of paperwork, there's a lack of documentation when they're arriving at Farview. And the second quote I have here towards the bottom, this is from an official, a judge who's actually coming to Farview just to inspect the premises basically, and look at some of the patients who are there. And he's writing about one inmate who writes, this is not the proper place for him, basically. It turns out it's a 14-year-old boy. This is not a place where we have people who are coming from the prison system, people who are, we have violent outbursts and things like that. And we have a child who's kind of living there amongst them. So of course it's a totally inappropriate place. And so this judge intervenes and gets him discharged immediately and sent to another facility where he's not going to be, potentially in harm's way or, living with other individuals who, there's just a lot of things that could have happened basically. And these are just two things that I was able to find in the records talking about some of these issues, which are really chronic here at Farview. And so this is kind of all building up to when we look at the records and we talk about looking for our own ancestors who might have been institutionalized. There are gaps in the records. There are going to be questions that we might have where it's not. We say, why was my ancestor sent to Farview? Like, did they do something bad? Did they break the law? Were they a criminal? The answer is not always. Sometimes we know that there's a lot of people who are sent here for various reasons, even though on paper Farview says it's only criminally insane people who are coming here. We know, looking at some of these other records, that the story is a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot of other kind of administrative and kind of budget reasons why sometimes people are being sent to Farview as well. So there's a much bigger story than what might just be on the page that we see or the story that we have in the family. All right, So Farview, like I said, it has a lot of these issues or things that are going on. And then in the 1960s, 1970s or so, that's when we see some major changes in how Farview is operated and how it's kind of making decisions about who is there and what their experiences are. And I'll just kind of touch over these very briefly. The first one is a major court case called Dixon v. Attorney General, which is decided in 1970. And this basically says that if you are an inmate at Farview, and you were sent here because you committed a crime and you got a prison sentence, and then you were transferred to Farview, you cannot be held here against your will beyond whatever your criminal sentence is, your maximum prison sentence. We have cases where they're finding that there are people who are at Farview and their prison sentence expired 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, long periods of time, and they're still at Farview. They're basically waiting for a doctor to say that you are no longer insane and you're not kind of posing any risks to your community when you go back home, and that's just never happening. So we have a lot of people who eventually kind of come together and sue the state as in a class action lawsuit and win. So that's one thing where we see a lot more people are being discharged from Farview after that. We have people who aren't staying for these very long, protracted periods of time. The second one is 1973, where the state passes the Industrial Peonage Abolition Act, which basically says that you cannot force people to work involuntarily and in any sort of labor program. So at the very least, you must pay these people and you cannot force them into any sort of labor program or any job while they're out of prison or a state hospital. So this kind of eats away at Farview's labor programs and what was kind of keeping them within their budget, basically. So that's something that's kind of a major change in people's experiences who are at Farview. And then the last one is the Philadelphia Inquirer. Some of their journalists they do a major investigation of Farview, and they published their findings in 1976 in a series of articles that are called the Farview Findings, actually won the Pulitzer Prize. But basically they find that there's been widespread abuse and neglect of the patients who've been there. Lots of deaths, which are being written in the official records as, oh, they had a heart attack or something like that, but it turns out they were beaten by guards, they were attacked by other inmates. There's a lot of really, really violent living conditions, basically, from a variety of reasons, and a variety of things happening. So they find that. And actually, I have a couple of, these are some of the newspapers there. Basically, the guards are saying that nobody ever complained in the past that these horrible living conditions were here because they wanted these people locked up and sent away. We didn't want them in society. So basically, they're kind of trying to justify this abuse and neglect. But after this, of course, the state does a lot of investigations and does basically a total overhaul of all the prison or the Farview kind of programs and administration. A lot of people are fired, a lot of new people are coming in. The state actually almost just closes Farview entirely, but changes their mind. But anyway, so this is kind of like a really big it shocks a lot of people. They're learning about what's happening here. And that there is constant overcrowding, and that there are a lot of people who are, facing really hard living conditions here when they're at Farview. So a lot changes after that. This is a picture of Farview today, and actually, you were asking about the big tower that's there. That's from the powerhouse or the power plant that's on the grounds. In 1995, the prison, and there's a variety of reasons for this, but one is that the state kind of changes its funding structure. So a lot of funding for state hospitals is kind of going away, and there's a lot more money available kind of for like criminal justice sorts of programs and facilities in the state. So basically prisons are getting a lot more money. So the state decides to convert Farview State Hospital into a state prison instead, which is still open today. And it would be what's called a forensic institution. So it's basically for inmates who are serving out their prison sentence who have some sort of mental illness or some sort of diagnosed condition like that. But it's still open today, although it's of course not open to the public, but it is still up there in Wayne County. That's a very general history of Farview State Hospital, but I kind of want to just focus on a couple of pieces of the history which can kind of impact the records that we have from Farview, and if we're ever doing genealogical research here, just kind of can tell us a little bit about the context around what records we might find and kind of the experiences we know our ancestors might have had while they were there. All right, so I'm going to kind of step away from the hospital as a whole, and I want to zoom in to tell the story about one particular inmate who was at Farview State Hospital. This is Lewis Ross, and I have been able to kind of piece this story together from records from a variety of places in the archives, He's got a really interesting story. So I thought by kind of zooming in and looking at him a little bit, we can learn about his life, but also if we have another ancestor who might have been at Farview, what their life might have been like as well. Lewis Ross was born in 1899 in Pittsburgh, and actually, ironically, his father was a policeman. But we know in the records that Ross joined in a lot of local street gangs and was kind of involved with those in his years. And very quickly, as a teenager, he finds he's very good at shoplifting and pickpocketing and the occasional robbery. At the age of 18, he was arrested for fleeing from a botched robbery job with a few accomplices and actually serves 15 months in the state juvenile industrial school, which is in Huntington County. It was called the Pennsylvania Industrial Reformatory at the time. I think today it's actually a state prison as well. But that's where he gets his start. We actually have his records from the Industrial Reformatory as well. And after serving that sentence at the Industrial Reformatory, he returns to Pittsburgh and goes right back into his life of crime. So he begins working on his own as a burglar. And we have a lot of newspapers from Pittsburgh at this time where they talk about some mysterious thief. They don't know who he is at the time. They just know there's somebody who can slip in, he's stealing jewels, he's stealing cash, all these other sorts of things. But he always slips away before the police or the guards can arrive. He's very elusive. The other thing they note is that this mystery burglar, who now knows Lewis Ross, he would constantly laugh at his victims. And they said this maniacal laugh. And so it's this really kind of sensational thing. The press really picks up on it. We have here squads of police ordered to shoot the robber on sight. It's this really kind of sensational thing. And then reporters end up calling Lewis Ross, they call him the laughing eel. So that's this kind of, he's this elusive guy, but he laughs at everybody. It's this great headline in the papers. And as we can see here, there's a lot of really sensational reporting. So it's kind of this embarrassment to the police and to the the criminal justice system that they can't catch him for so long. It's this big robbery spree. Eventually, though, Lewis Ross, he's trying to lay low up in St. Paul, Minnesota for a while, but he can't help himself. He tries to rob another store, and he is eventually caught. And this time, he's extradited back to Pittsburgh, and there's this really kind of this huge courtroom trial. Let's see, we have his notes. Very quickly, the judge finds him guilty of several counts of robbery. Ross pleads guilty to this. And the judge, if we look at the court records from the time, kind of notes the violent and frightening nature of these crimes, this laugh that's going on during all these crimes. And so Ross is given the maximum sentence allowed by law, which is 6 to 10 years. And the judge says this is what's in the best interests of society. Again, so talk about society needs him locked up, he needs to be far away from all this. He's dangerous, we don't understand him, somebody that we don't want to deal with. So that's what happens to Ross. He gets the 6 to 10 year prison sentence. So the next part of Ross's story is a little fuzzy. There aren't a lot of records, but from what I've been able to piece together, Ross is sent to Western State Penitentiary, which is a state prison in Pittsburgh, and he goes there to serve his sentence. So I have a few pictures up here of Western State Pen, which is closed today, but it's a prison that's been around for a long time in Pittsburgh. And then let's go one forward. This is Ross's identification card from Western State Penitentiary. It's something we also have in the archives. I don't know if you can read it from where you're sitting, but actually at the bottom of the screen, on the bottom of the card, it has a list there of other places, other facilities where Ross had been in the past, and it notes the state prison in Minnesota where he was when he was initially arrested, and then before that, it notes that he was in the Pennsylvania Industrial Reformatory. It says PIR, and so actually when I was doing my research on Ross, I saw this and I saw, oh, okay, he was at the Reformatory, and I went and checked our records from that other institution. I found him there, so kind of starting with one record, and it gave me clues to look in other places. And this is something we'll talk about with our own ancestors. I say always expect that they were in more than one institution at some point during their life. If they're in one place, it might be in another. That was definitely the case with Ross. All right, so let me go to the next slide here. After spending 2 years at Western State Penitentiary, the records say that Ross allegedly suffers some sort of nervous breakdown. Doesn't go into details, it just says he has a nervous breakdown. And prison officials, and this was going to be in the 1920s, prison officials decided to send him to Farview State Hospital. So like we said before, Farview is this institution whenever we have any kind of mental illness present or just anyone who's a problem inmate, quote unquote, they're going to be sent to Farview. That happens a lot, where a lot of prison and state hospital superintendents have a lot of leeway where they can send whoever they want to Farview, send them over there. Transferring to Farview, in theory, meant that Ross would be treated for his condition, and when he had improved, he would return back to prison where he would finish out his sentence. But in reality, as we'll see, this really turned out to be a life sentence for Lewis Ross. That slide should not be there, so I'm gonna skip it. Okay. So what we know is that when Ross arrives at Farview, he's seen very briefly. It's probably less than 10 minutes, we don't know, but it says very briefly. He's seen by a doctor and classified as schizophrenic. And then, as far as we know, he is never again examined or given any kind of therapy from any medical professionals at Farview or anyone else for that matter. This is a short line in the text of Farview's admission register that I have up here on the screen. This is the only surviving record that documents, that even mentions the name Lewis Ross in any of Farview's record. So it just lists his name, his admission date, his original criminal sentence, and his initial diagnosis, which says that he's insane, and that he's schizophrenic. And so this is really the only documentation we have. We know Lewis Ross is at Farview for 10 years, and then for 15 years, and then for 20 years, and then 30 years. And it's in the 1950s, he's still here. His criminal sentence has expired decades ago, but yet Ross still remains at Farview. No examinations, no therapy, no treatment of any kind. That being said, Ross does seem to have improved a little bit, despite his lack of treatment or anything. Later on, they would ask staff, and they said that as early as 1940 or so, they thought that he had improved in his condition and he didn't need to remain incarcerated at Farview. They said his trademark laugh and any other manifestations of schizophrenia had disappeared. Attendants said that he was pleasant and coherent and relevant and normal in every respect, and that comes from a later court docket. And remember that his original sentence was 6 to 10 years. And we're talking about decades after this. Nevertheless, Ross requests several times to be re-examined or to be heard for parole or for to be released, and he's denied every year that he applies for this. So without anyone advocating for Ross's release, he's trapped at Farview. So what does Ross do about that? Eventually he decides that enough is enough. He begins, he bets on sports with the guards, and he gets a little bit of money in his pocket in 1954. With $200 in his pocket, he escapes from Farview and hitchhikes all the way back to Pittsburgh. When he gets to Pittsburgh, he goes immediately to the office of an attorney who is friends with his father, says, I want to sue the state for my own freedom. That's the only way that I'm going to be able to, get back to my life, basically. And so before long, Ross is back in the courthouse fighting for his freedom. And so it's this really big sensational case. There's a lot of reporters and people who were involved with him in the 20s from his original arrest. And they are coming, they're subpoenaing, they issue subpoenas against Farview and a lot of its doctors and superintendents. They have to come and testify in this case. And so let me just look at my notes real quick. Staff from Farview come and testify against Ross, saying that he is still a danger to society, he still requires treatment and rehabilitation, despite the fact that he hadn't been examined for over 30 years. But Ross's attorney, who's kind of prepared for this, he hires several psychiatrists who would work for the state and other mental hospitals, and they examine Ross, and they both testify that he's clearly sane and does not belong at Farview or any other mental institution in the state. In the opinion for the case or in the decision, the judge orders Ross's immediate release and says that it was clear that Farview was illegally incarcerating him, even though because he had no mental illness and his prison sentence had expired 23 years earlier. The judge also said, and here's a quote from the case records, the road to Farview could properly be classified as the road of no return. And he said that Farview's policy is basically the fact that they weren't examining patients, they were just letting them stay well beyond whatever their criminal sentence was. Meant that no person incarcerated for an infraction of the law or because of some mental illness would ever have the hope of returning to society because of the fear that they would revert to a life of crime or revert to prior mental delusions. So basically the judge finds that the state hospital is holding people for longer than their sentence because they were just worried if they go back and return to society and they ever commit another crime, people are going to come back and say, why did this hospital release these people? So there's fear of something might happen if we release them. At least that's kind of the thinking amongst the staff at Farview. And what that results in is a lot of people who are staying there with no hope of ever being released, regardless of what the reality of their experience was there. So Ross's case is unusual just because he has this really sensational escape and he has this big court case where he's suing for his freedom and he wins. And here is a picture of after his release. So Don't really know what happens to him after release. It says he goes to live with his niece in Pittsburgh, and that's kind of the end of the paper trail for Lewis Ross, at least that I've been able to find. It's a really interesting case. There's a lot more to it than I just kind of had in these little slides. But it's, that's just that's what we do know about him. We also have the archives, letters that Lewis Ross's attorney is writing to the governor saying that in the course of arguing this case, I have been contacted by family members of dozens of other Farview inmates who say that they had the exact same issue, basically that they're also being held against their will, and that there's no hope for them being released from the state hospital either. So that's kind of, my sense is that Lewis Ross's story is not unique, that even though we don't have documentation of other specific people who are being held, even though they are not insane, even though they don't have these kind of violent criminal tendencies, there are still people in Farview who are being, held there against their will for long periods of time. Like I said before, there is a class action lawsuit which ends in 1970, which does away with this practice, so people cannot be held after their prison sentence anymore, but that's still 15 years or so after this. This case ends in 1955. So we know that this is kind of a chronic thing that's happening at Farview for the first 50 plus years of its existence. Remember, Farview opens in 1908 and it's open. This is the 50s, 60s, and 70s that we're talking about. So that's kind of his story there. This is the picture, another one that we have from our Western State Penitentiary records, but these are Lewis Ross's actual fingerprints when he was booked. So I remember when I found these, it was just kind of this really special moment where it's like, this is his actual fingerprint. Like I have this kind of connection with him, which is, these records are digitized, but I think kind of seeing them in person, I think that's one of the special things about doing genealogical research like this. I felt like I had this connection with somebody who I've been reading about for so long, kind of finding a story. And that's something I want to talk about. So why is Lewis Ross's case important? Why is that important to us as genealogists? It's an interesting story with this guy called the Laughing Eel. He has this string of robberies. It's fun to read about. He has this cool escape from a prison and everything like that. But I think, what does that mean for us as genealogists? One is, I think we shouldn't take all the records we see at face value. I think they can tell us a story. They can kind of lead us towards what might have happened to an ancestor, but it's not going to tell us everything. Or that the records, they might, I don't think exaggerate is the right word. They might kind of distort what's actually going on in one way or another. So we always want to look at records. They're super valuable. They can tell us things, but they don't tell us the whole story. And we know that at Farview, there's always more parts of these stories that aren't going to be in the inmate records that we're looking at. Another thing that's important to think about is that, at least in Pennsylvania, and I suspect this is the same for other states, one person's story can also, it's going to be in multiple institutions. So Lewis Ross's story is not just in Farview, but it's also in Western State Penitentiary in Pittsburgh. It's also in this prison in Minnesota where he is for a little while. It's also in the Industrial Reformatory in Huntington. It's in the newspapers. It's in the court records, which still exist from Allegheny County. So there's one person, but we have to look for his records in many different places. And I know those of us who've done genealogical research, we know that we have to be prepared to look at many different places. And I think this is just a really great illustration that, yes, that's something we always need to be prepared for, especially when we're looking at people in the past who were in the prison or the state hospital system. And then the other thing, just I think these fingerprints always say, there's a lot of rewards to doing this research, even though it can be complicated, it can take a long time. But at the end of the day, when you find something like this, I think for me at least, when you find the fingerprints literally that are on our ancestors' records, we can really, it's worth the wait, it's worth the time and effort. I think that, so I would definitely encourage you all, if you're thinking about this, go for it. Definitely take the time and look for your ancestors, because if you can find something, it'll really be, worth the wait. All right, so that's the story of Farview, the institution. That's the story of Lewis Ross, one Farview inmate. So I want to talk about, hopefully I've convinced us all, yes, I want to go to the state archives. I want to look at these records. I want to research my ancestors who were in a prison, who were in a hospital, who were in somewhere like Farview. So the state archives, we can talk about this all day. The state archives has hundreds of thousands of documents from dozens of institutions, whether they're state hospitals or prisons or some of these other types of facilities that were all across the state. We saw the map with dozens of institutions dotting the state. From Farview, and so like I said, I helped bring a lot of these records over. They were all stored at the Waymark prison for a long time in the superintendent's closet, basically. So I think it was about 10 years ago, they decided to transfer them over to the state archives. We went and picked them up. From Farview State Hospital, I have a list of the major types of records that we have, and they're all at the state archives in Record Group 23, which is our records from the State Department of Human Services. That's the larger agency that oversees all the state hospitals. We have admission and discharge books. We have a lot of pamphlets and books and booklets that are written about the prison. Annual reports. We have an inmate newspaper, which was around for several years, which is really interesting. The inmates are writing articles about, oh, like we had a baseball game today, or we did this and we did that, and actually mentions a lot of inmates by name, so it says what specific people are doing while they're there. Really interesting. We have a lot of daily record books, which are written by superintendent and other staff, captain's reports, copies of articles and newspaper clippings that are about Farview, that are written kind of from the outside about major and important events that are happening at Farview. Board of Trustee minutes, so we can learn about some of the bigger trends that are happening at Farview, and a lot of photographs like the one I have up here on screen, which are one of my favorite things to see. It's neat. I mean, you can read about stuff, but when you actually get to see it, I think that helps us understand a place a lot better. So that's what we have from Farview. This is pretty consistent with what we have from other state hospitals and prisons in the state. These are the general kinds of records that we can usually expect to find from a state institution. This is a picture of one of the pages in Farview State Hospital's admission and discharge book. It's a little worse for wear, some of the pages. They've been around for a long time. This page is from 1913. But as you can see, each line in here is for a different individual who's admitted at Farview, and they're all listed in order of admission. So, on Monday, one guy comes in, he gets written in the top row. A couple days later, somebody else is admitted, they go on the line beneath them. So if we're looking for ancestors, they're not going to be, it's not in alphabetical order, so we can't just go to, the S page or something like that. So we'll talk about this in a little bit, but when we're doing this kind of research, having some sort of sense of when they might have been admitted is really the best way for us to try and locate these people. It helps us at least start looking in the right area, because typically these records are going to be organized in chronological order by the time of admission. Anyways, with this page, you can see there's a lot of information. And let me just go, oh, that's a picture. That's me as a young archivist 10 years ago, picking up this very same ledger book. It was very heavy, it weighed like 40 pounds. I'm struggling to hold it in this picture and smile, because I almost was going to fall over if I wasn't leaning against something. Had a little bit of help from one of the staff from the prison there. It's a huge book, there's a lot of information in it. These are what I thought some of the column headers in this book were that are the most important for genealogical research. So we've got a lot on here. We have the name of the inmate, of course. They have an inmate number, which is assigned, which can help us find information about them, which might be in other additional sets of records that we have at the archives. Because usually that inmate number is gonna follow them around. It's gonna be on every other document that we have related to them. We have admission and discharge dates, so when they came in and when they left. We have their age at the time of admission usually. We have race, we have what county they lived in at the time of admission. They have their marital status, their occupation. We have how they were committed, so did they come from a court where they found insane in a court of law? Did they come from another state hospital or an almshouse or a prison or some other sort of facility? We have their mental diagnosis, or what they would call supposed case of insanity. That's another thing that's listed. We have the cause of discharge, which is going to be why did they leave Farview eventually, whether that's they were released, they died there, they escaped, they were transferred somewhere else again, which happens pretty frequently. So why did they leave Farview? How long did they spend there? Did they have any other known relatives who were insane? Again, that can be really useful for genealogy. And then there's a column for special remarks, and they can have a lot of other information that's really kind of pertinent and you might not find in other genealogical records. So there's a lot jam-packed into these pages. This is a zoom in of one of those pages. These are the first 4 individuals from York County that I was able to find. And I thought, of course, the first one admitted, that first one at the top from York County is a cigar maker by trade, so it seemed very appropriate for York County. The other ones are listed as 2 were farmers and 1 was a cooper. So this is just, again, one of the many pages that you'll find, but the majority of folks who are in here, we're going to find are from where more people are living in the state. I think there's more people from Philadelphia who are going to be sent here than York County, which has a smaller population. But flipping through the pages, I saw people from all 67 counties in Pennsylvania. So it really is a statewide institution. Whereas other state hospitals are a little more geographic in their focus, like Harrisburg State Hospital is typically people from central Pennsylvania. We have other facilities in the east and west that are going to be more kind of focused on people from those areas. But because Farview was kind of this specialized institution that no other place in the state had people with the kind of the same conditions as Farview, we'll have people from all over the place there. Another thing that I thought was interesting is after a couple of years, Farview changes their admission books and they add another column where it says brought from. And so again, it explicitly lists what other facility somebody came from before they came to Farview, so where are they transferred from. And here's just one example here. It lists, let me see. I think these are all pretty much state and county prisons. So again, there's this really close relationship with the prison system in the state. I saw plenty of other ones that are county almshouses and that they'll list other courts and things like that. But again, always be prepared to have to do a search in many different areas of record, whether it's different institutions, whether it's a facility and legal records and newspaper records or something like that. But the stories of these people almost always happens in many different places. Unfortunately, there's not, one hospital that has all the records all in one little handy folder. But that makes the genealogical research all the more rewarding once you finally get to everything and you find everything you're looking for. A couple of things just to note generally about looking at state hospital records and state archives. I would suggest never just knock on our door and say, I want to look at state hospital records. Always call ahead. These are really complicated records and there's some kind of unique access policies and rules related to them. Typically at the state archives, all non-patient or non-inmate records are always going to be open to the public to look at for any reason. But if any records have personally identifying information that contains mental health or just general medical information, state law requires that the state archives restrict those records from public access. So if a record is less than 75 years old, those are going to be closed for public access, for researcher access. The only exception is if that individual's been deceased for 50 or more years. So if we have an ancestor that we know was at any state hospital, it doesn't matter if it's Farview or anywhere else, if we know they were at a certain state hospital, the state archive staff can search the records and look, and if it's been more than 75 years, we can show those records to you. If it's been less than 75 years, you're going to have to produce an obituary, a death certificate, some sort of official documentation confirming that that person's been deceased for 50 or more years. And then after that, then we can open those records to you. There are some older records, 19th century ones especially, where the entire volume is more than 75 years. So you could come and look through that. But a lot of times, like that admission book I was showing you, that goes from 1912 to 1995. So it's a really long date range. And so unfortunately, a researcher can't come and look in the first few pages because the rest of them are restricted. So that's why I say always call ahead. Tell the archivist there what you're looking for. They can tell you if those record sets are open or closed, or if you're going to have to produce, show us a death certificate or something. Basically, they'll tell you what needs to be done so that you can get to this information. A lot of times, there's a lot of restrictions that come on them, whether it's a legal restriction or just, as the archives policy. So always call ahead. Never just kind of come in and expect to see these records immediately, because there's a lot that goes along with them. Another thing, the state archives does, you can visit in person or you can call or email the state archives. And like I say, try and know a little bit about your ancestor when you're coming here. It helps with the search to find information about them. Make sure that you've got the full name of the ancestor. I can't tell you how many times there's two people with the exact same name who are in the same institution at some point, even at the same time sometimes. Jonathan probably knows this better than anybody. You've seen a lot of people. So always have their full name, including any kind of maiden name or other names that they might have been known by. Sometimes it's hard to say which of those names is going to be kind of the official one in the record. Sometimes I'll see variations on spellings and things like that as well. Know what their birth and death dates are. That really helps the archivist confirm if we've got the right guy or not. Like I said, sometimes we've got two people with the same name. One is born in the 1880s, the other one is born in the 1930s. So it helps be pretty certain we've got the right guy. Any sense of when approximately they might have come and left a state hospital or a state prison, that helps with the search. Just again, these records are always chronological by the time that they arrive at an institution, so it helps to kind of narrow down our search when the archivists are looking for them. Knowing where that person lived, what county they're from at the time they were admitted to the hospital. That's typically something that's gonna be documented in the record, so I always recommend having, if to the best of your knowledge, knowing where they live. If you know a patient admission number, sometimes people have that, that's always helpful to know. If you know what institution they went to specifically, that's also, again, sometimes people will see that listed in a census or some other kind of record that they already have. And then, like I said, some sort of proof of their death, whether it's a death certificate, an obituary, something else like a coroner's report or something like that. That's gonna be especially useful if we have any ancestors who are at a state hospital from, 1950 and earlier at this point, because those records sometimes are gonna be, 1950 or later, because a lot of those records are still restricted at this point, so we've gotta have that before we can open them up to you. So that's a little bit about how we access those records. I have up here on the screen, here's the number for the reference department at the state archives and also their email address. You can always just contact them ahead of time and just explain that you're looking for information that might be in these state hospital records, and then they can kind of help you proceed from there. A lot of times, it's always good to have a little bit of extra help. The other state archivists there, they know as much about these records as I do. They're really knowledgeable about them. So they're a great bunch of people to work with. I know Jonathan can definitely vouch for that. We have a great website. They just recently changed the URL. It used to just be pa.gov/archives. So that's been done away with. It's kind of a long thing here. www.pa.gov/agencies/phmc/PA State Archives. Or if you just Google Pennsylvania State Archives, you're going to find us. So that's something we can do. Here's a picture of our catalog website. You can use this to find all the different types of records that we have at the state archives. And you can, kind of go from there and get a better sense of what we have. You can call a reference department, and they'll help you, actually access those records, whether you're visiting in person or whether you are, emailing us and we're sending you a scan of something. So that's a great thing to look through. This is the page in the catalog for Farview State Hospital. So it says here, if you look it off, we have 10 boxes of records. It's got a nice little description of Farview State Hospital to tell you more about it. And there are pages like this for all the other state hospitals and prisons in the state. You can see all the different types of records we have listed from them. I'm going to wrap up there. I know there's a lot of things I didn't cover, but I'm hopeful we'll cover them in questions, or if you just want to come and find me afterwards, we can chat about them. I've got my name, my number, and my contact up on the screen. I got a couple of hands up, so we can just jump right into that. Adam, go ahead.
There's some people online who have been waiting.
Okay,
patiently.
great.
I can get back to the Q&A. First question, this is from Bonnie in Arizona. She's asking, she's asking for some specific stuff. I'm thinking maybe this is a conversation she'd want to have privately.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the first question is, can you discuss what materials the archives may have on Retreat State Hospital outside of Wilkes-Barre?
Yeah, we do have a fair amount of records from Retreat, it's a closed facility. Retreat was also turned into a state prison at one point in time, and Retreat's state correctional institution at Retreat was closed several years ago. I have to look in the catalog, but I do believe that from the state hospital years, we're going to have admission and discharge records. So that's going to be probably the best place. For most state hospitals, at a bare minimum, we're going to have admission and discharge records, like a ledger book, like the one I showed from Farview. And then we're going to have annual reports and other sorts of administrative records that tell us kind of what life was like. So, like, did they have a farm that people worked on? Did they have other labor programs? Did they have a baseball team? Or, were there other things that were going on? So definitely, yeah, my contact's up here on the screen. Feel free to get in touch and we can talk about Retreat specifically. But yeah, that would be at the bare minimum. We're going to have kind of those admission discharge ledgers, which have the types of information. We talk, what was their diagnosis? Where did they come from? Do they have any other family members? When did they leave? What was the nature of that dismissal or discharge? That sort of thing. All right, next question.
There's a question from Anonymous. Have you published on the topic of your talk? If yes, could you send bibliographic information?
Yeah, sure. I could probably share that with Jonathan if you want to, while it's anonymous. Yes, I published an article, a really long one, about Farview State Hospital in Pennsylvania History, which is the journal that's published by the Pennsylvania Historical Association. I think the article is called Criminal and Insane, a long history of Farview State Hospital, something like that. I think it was published in 2019, so it's been a couple of years, but yeah, if you look for the Pennsylvania History Journal, that is there. I also published another article about Lewis Ross and his story specifically, which is online. It's there's an online medical history blog called Nursing Cleo. And so I think if you just Google Laughing Eel Lewis Ross, it's probably going to show up. There's not too many other things on the internet that have Laughing Eel in the name, pretty unique moniker. So you should be able to find that one, but yeah, the other one's going to be in the journal, which is, should be fairly easy to find online at this point. It's been more than 5 years.
I have a few more, but I don't know if you want to start working on. Yeah. Just
Anybody here? Anything on our minds?
Are any of the original buildings still existing?
Yeah, so I've been there 10 years ago or so, and when I was there, let me scroll back real quick. Next slide. I'm gonna go through a lot of slides real quick. Where's Alright, a lot of slides. This building is left, this is kind of like so the way they built it, so the buildings originally were like, it almost looks like these like square blocks where it's a ring of buildings and then there's a open grassy space in the middle. So that way the inmates who are there, so they're either inside in the kind of the ward areas or they go inside in the grassy space, but they're never outside of the facility ever. And so some of those original ones are still left. Right now they kind of serve as like administrative space. And I'm not sure if there's actually inmates who are living there or not. There's a lot of additional buildings that have been built, but yeah, some of these original brick buildings, I actually have a better picture of it. Yeah, there you go. Okay, you can kind of see. Yeah, so they're kind of like these like squarish circular shapes. Several of those are still left. Parts of the original powerhouse with the big smokestack, that's still there. Some of the original farm buildings I think are left, but not many of them. I think Farview, when that one law was passed that kind of did away with that involuntary labor, I think they sold a lot of the acreage to local farmers because they couldn't keep operating the farm. So a lot of those buildings are gone at this point. But yeah, some of those original ones are still left on the grounds. Any other questions? Jonathan?
I just wanted to say two things. One thing you brought out is that this is not so much about Farview, but other state hospitals. People weren't always put there because they were insane. It's just that that was a convenient place to put somebody when you couldn't handle them at home.
Yeah.
And so even if your ancestor was not legally mentally ill, they still might have been in a state hospital for some sort of treatment. And the other thing I wanted to mention, which I thought you were going to show today, is I think you found a case where an African American was arrested for a traffic violation in Westchester. You remember that case? And he had like a 6-month sentence, and he ended up being at Farview for, what was it, 20 or 30 years or something?
Yeah, and that's, we know about the really extreme case like this because they're a little more well documented, because when somebody finds out, there's always either a court case or an investigation, something in the news. I'm going to look it up real quick because there was another scholar who that came out of her work. So I did not find that, but it's well documented. But there's a great book. We had one of our scholar in residences who looked at kind of the whole state hospital system and how it changed in the 20th century. Okay, who's that called?
I guess one of the points I wanted to make is there was a racial component sometimes to this as well.
Yeah, and that's something that's documented. I'll try and look up that book and share it with everyone in a moment. But Wayne County is a very white area in Pennsylvania. In fact, a lot of their staff are unemployed coal workers who are looking for any kind of job. So this is the only place in town that's hiring. And then, like I said, there's a lot of folks in Philadelphia who are being sent here because that's the large population area in the state. And so that's something that is documented where they're saying that the race relations that are going on here are just really abysmal, especially in the 70s when the Farview Findings series of articles is put out, where they're saying there's just a lot of racism that's going on. You have kind of this white guards, black inmates, and so it's just a lot of trouble stems from that, and a little oversight from the state. Farview was basically allowed to operate as it saw fit with very little oversight until the 70s, when things just get so bad that everything is redone. They basically from the ground up they're rebuilding how this place is operating. But yeah, there's a really great book. I need to find it because the name of it is escaping me. But they talk about that case that you're talking about. as well as many other ones. There's another case. I think it's Philadelphia State Hospital, but there's a woman there and everyone says, oh, she's insane. She just babbles. Nobody can understand. It turns out she spoke Ukrainian only. She's an immigrant and just no one could understand her. And they just thought she was insane. She didn't have any family. So she's sent to the state hospital and she was there until somebody there who can speak Ukrainian finally can communicate with her. In fact, she's not insane at all. She just, nobody could understand her. We know these really sensational cases. There's a lot of people who just, we don't have a lot of records. They could have had the same experience. They could have been different. It's just, yeah, I think that's something, like you said, sometimes people say, yeah, what did my ancestors do wrong? Like, what was their crime? What was their thing that they did? Because they must have been sent here for a reason. Sometimes, yes, there is a reason. It's well documented, but other times we just know the records don't tell us the whole story. So that's just, I think, just something to be aware of. That's, I think, a challenge of looking at these kinds of records where the state isn't, documenting, or that the records aren't, everything isn't surviving all of it. We know some specific cases like Lewis Ross, like this gentleman from Westchester County. So I think it's just, we know enough to say there could be more to these stories with our ancestors. We might not ever find out that whole story, but it could be there. It's just something to be aware of. Adam, go ahead.
There's a question from Kimberly, which I think is great. Are the inmate newspapers available online?
They're not. That's something that I hope will be digitized, but as of right now, they're only available to see at the state archives. I know other places, other archives have things from other prisons that are digitized. I know Eastern State Penitentiary has a great series of inmate papers, which the Eastern State Penitentiary Historical Society has digitized a lot of those. So my hope is that Farview will be digitized at some point. They're also pretty fragile. Newspapers are kind of flaking away. So I think for many reasons, they should be digitized soon, but they haven't been yet. Thank you for asking.
Another very basic question for me, and I'm
Yes.
sorry if I missed this, but were there also female patients at Farview?
Not at Farview, so it was men only.
Okay.
I think if women who kind of, were considered criminally insane or something like that, they're probably gonna go to the state prison in Muncie, which is kind of the more maximum security facility for women, which is open sometimes in the very early 20th century. It's still actually open as a state prison today. That would be my guess, although they could have gone to other places, but to my knowledge, there have never been women at Farview.
Did women work there?
I've never seen it. They may have, not that I'm probably as clerks, I would say, or other kind of administrative roles, but no, I think in the actual, like, in the cells and everything, it would have just been men at the time. Okay. I cannot find the name of that book and it's killing me now, but if you look it up, there is a book about Pennsylvania state prisons and hospitals. And it's great, and I recommend you read it, but it talks about the case. There's only so many things I can fit into a presentation like this, and there's so many stories that deserve a lot more attention and looking at and everything, have a light shown on them. So I talked about one hospital and one inmate story, and I promise you that there are thousands more like this that are all worth reading, whether it's your own ancestor or somebody else. So I really would encourage you, if you have time, come look at the records. They're really special. They tell a lot of important stories, and they deserve a lot more attention, I think, than they deserve, just because they're hard to look at. There's just, it's hard to get to them. They're organized in a kind of complicated way. We know that there's kind of these gaps in what's in them, or there's more to the story than's on the page. But it's, you can find a lot of really interesting things in them. Adam, go ahead.
Kimberly wrote in and said Cold Storage by Wendell Rawls.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's one book. There's another book called The Shoe Leather Treatment, which is published in the 1970s, and that's what they called it for you. It's the shoe leather treatment. They beat you with shoes. But again, there's a lot of kind of exposés and things, and this is from former inmates who are writing about their experiences. I think the Cold Storage book that was published, I think it was published in the 70s or 80s, was also turned into a film or a movie. I think it was like a made-for-TV movie. I haven't seen it myself. But yeah, if you look at Farview, has a really, there's a lot of abuse and neglect. And I didn't really get into the vast details. A lot of them are pretty gory that we see. And that's the thing, like, we don't know, was this everybody's experience? Was this only kind of certain people who were there, whether it's, the kind of the race relations or it's other individuals for whatever reason. That's the hard thing where we don't know specifically, but we know that's a chronic thing that's occurring here, occurs at other facilities as well. I would say generally by this 1980s or so, it reforms in a lot of ways. A lot of this does go away. it still happens somewhere, but it's not as rampant as it was kind of in the 70s and before. But yes, that's something it's no secret. It's very well documented in Farview and other places like it. So yeah, there are other places you can find more information out about those aspects of its history. Any other questions from the online folks? All right. Yeah, definitely come and chat with me if I'll stick around for here, and then anyone else for the online audience. Yeah, like I said, I love talking to people about these records because I like it when people find what they're looking for. So it's my job to help you find those things. So thank you for taking the time today. I'll see you. I'm sure I'll come back for something. So I'll see you at the next one. Thank you.
Our meeting is adjourned, but you're welcome to hang around, talk to Tyler if you'd like to do so.
Thanks.
That's just.
Through that, so there's 20 times, because it's right down the road from camp, okay? And in fact, before 1995, yeah, he used to be able to wander the ground. Go there and with an interest in industrial theology, yeah, and some of those buildings just have to be real, yeah. And I didn't realize that the bricks were actually like